So the speaker is Dr. William Davies. He is a consultant psychologist and head of applied clinical psychology at the APT. Post-qualification courses written by him have been studied by over 125,000 mental health professionals, meaning that his input has influenced interventions with literally millions of people. So it is all yours, Will.
Lovely, thanks, Amy. So I'll tell you a bit about higher order therapy or helicopter therapy, which is where this session comes from today. So the idea is that if you were in a helicopter flying around overhearing what was going on in therapy all over the country, you would hear therapists doing things like assessment, case formulation, collecting evidence about how things are going, and so on. So you in the helicopter decided if you're going to be a really good therapist, then you better do all of those things. That's kind of the first step. And then because you're flying over some people who are DBT therapists, you overhear them and you decide you better teach your patients the important life skills they need, because that's what DBT therapists are doing. And because you're flying over some CBT therapists, you decide you better examine patients' thinking style and their problem-solving abilities and so on, because that's what CBT therapists are doing. And because you're flying over some solution-focused therapy therapists, you decide you better look what your patients can already do from their own resources. And because you're flying over some ACT therapists, acceptance and commitment therapy, you decide you better help patients live according to their own values and principles and so on. And so you accumulate the total wisdom of the therapist you fly over. And that's what higher order therapy or helicopter therapy aims to do. And today is actually the last higher order therapy session. Next week, we're going to be doing a summary of DBT because people are very interested in that. So if you want to find out more about higher order therapy, you need to go to 3ws.aptonlinetraining, or one word, aptonlinetraining.com, and have a look in there. And remember, the sessions are recorded. They're free to access, so you can send your colleagues or whoever you like to 3ws.apt.ac and search for free webinars. And you can get all the previous ones there as well. So there we are. But today's topic is functional analysis. Very important one, I think. And I'm not surprised we had about 600 people register to attend. So we'll have probably quite a lot of those turn up, I guess. It is a slightly longer one, but there's plenty of space for contributions and questions, just as normal. And it's a general forum. Some people come just to have a bit of a chat. So by all means, say how things have affected your work, if you like what I was doing. So there's no poll, but a question to begin with. What do you understand by the term functional analysis? So have a ponder, put that in chat, whatever you consider, put that in chat. So that gets us sharing our view of what functional analysis is. And while you're doing that, just one thing. When Amy clicks play, it either sends her into hyperspace, only to reappear 10 minutes later, or it goes into studio quality sound, which is a bit disconcerting. It's going to be most likely the latter, but don't worry, we can stop and talk anytime we like, just the same as normal. So are you feeling brave, Amy?
I'm ready to go, apart from being on mute. So we have functional analysis today. Put all your questions in chat to panelists and attendees if you'd like to, and we can stop at any time for some lovely hard questions to challenge Will with. So let me play the audio. Let me just check I'm sharing computer sound. Yep, play the audio. So I'll come back to your ideas about functional analysis as well, but I'll start the audio because, as Will said, there's quite a lot to do, but then I will stop it as soon as we've got some questions. See you in a bit.
Hello, and welcome to the APT's session on functional analysis. Functional analysis, working out just why people do what they do, is undoubtedly one of the most interesting areas of psychology. And the word analysis makes it sound so logical and controlled, and yet we find ourselves grappling with conjecture, speculation, and hypothesis. Let me tell you a story of an extreme example of functional analysis where I saw a woman who was unable to walk. She was confined to a wheelchair, and yet there was no organic explanation for her paralysis. She and her husband were very well off and had 2 glamorous teenage daughters and a matchingly glamorous lifestyle, at least for the husband, who was completely enchanted by the daughters. His wife, approaching 50 or so, seemed unable to hold his attention to quite the same degree as the daughters, and it seemed even more unfortunate when she slowly developed this paralysis and was unable to walk. But there was one silver lining to the cloud, namely that he had to be more attentive to her, at least in regard of her everyday needs and generally looking after her and caring for her. So we can see that her affliction actually served a clear purpose or a clear function for her. This is certainly not to say that she was pretending to be paralyzed or wanted to be paralyzed or was putting it on or anything like that. It is a process that occasionally takes place in the deeper parts of the brain below conscious awareness. So in her case, she really was paralyzed, and unless we could find a better way for her to attract her husband's real love and attention, then we were unlikely to cure her of her paralysis. In fact, I was a student, as an undergrad student, as part of a gaggle of London students put together by the doctor looking after her. And our task was to be with her pretty much round the clock. To what purpose, I'm not really too sure now. So we can see that, in fact, her wealthy husband, rather than paying more attention to her himself, actually employed others to do that for him. So do we suppose that such an intervention would work? No, I guess we wouldn't, and sure enough it didn't. At least not in the time that I was involved, which was quite a few months. So to me, that's an interesting story on 2 counts. First, it shows the complexity of the brain, how the deep brain can do things which the logical brain might not recommend. I'm sure the patient in this case wouldn't recommend herself to become paralyzed, though she would maybe like her husband to pay her the same attention as he had done previously. And second thing, before we come up with some exotic formulation about the behavior having some deep-seated function below the level of conscious awareness, we have to be really sure that there isn't a physical cause for what we are seeing. Supposing, for instance, in this case, the paralysis turned out to be caused by an undiagnosed tumour pressing on a crucial nerve, and we were all wasting our time acting on some psychological formulation. That would have been unforgivable. Nevertheless, the point is that some of the things that people do serve a purpose or a function. It often seems like people do things which are very much against their interests. For example, a lot of adolescents deliberately harm themselves by cutting their arms and all sorts of things. On the face of it, that doesn't seem to be a very good idea. But if you talk to most people who harm themselves, it turns out that the self-harm actually fulfills a very good function or purpose, in that it reduces their distress or tension or agitation. As people grow older, they get better at finding other ways of reducing their distress, so they deliberately self-harm less. Quite naturally, because harming yourself has all sorts of unwanted consequences to it, like scars and so forth. So it's much better if you can find alternative ways that don't have those disadvantages. And our job as a therapist is to help them find those alternative ways of achieving the same function. And in this case, alternative ways of reducing their distress, of course. I think when we put it like that, it seems a very obvious strategy, and yet it's a new one to most of the people concerned. Most parents and those who love the person who self-harms are very distressed by it. I will say things like, "Why do you do that to yourself? Can't you see the damage it's causing?" And so on and so forth. So when we come along and in a sense validate what the person does by making sense of it, and we say things like, well, if you find a great sense of relief when you self-harm, it's understandable that you do it. But wouldn't it be great to find another way of getting the same sense of relief which doesn't have the disadvantages? And of course, most people who self-harm say, yes, I would. But what would that be? Is there another way of getting the same sense of relief? You might wonder whether this applies to anything else other than self-harm. And how would you know, or how would you find out? But if you've done the input on assessment, the APT input about assessment, you'll remember that one of the things we asked the patient was whether there are any advantages to what they did, any advantages to their problem, whether there's any silver lining to the cloud that is their problem. And in terms of functional analysis, that is a key question. It tells us the function that the behavior might be serving for the patient.
Just had somebody ask if everyone can hear the recording. Would somebody be able to tell us if they can? Is everyone all right?
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, super. Thanks, everyone. There's some lovely yeses.
It's just clear.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you, everybody.
Why they might be doing it. And that's why it's important to ask the question properly and to give the patient plenty of chance to think around it and come up with any good ideas they might have. Just to repeat, though, they're not doing it deliberately, so in a sense, their guess is no better than ours. It's just getting the information out is the key thing. Let me give you another example of a behavior serving a function. This was a guy called Richard who actually had a lot of problems, and he was living in a residential facility for people like himself. One of his habits was to occasionally throw stones at the windows of the facility from the outside, with the result that he broke the windows, obviously. But this only happened from time to time. It wasn't like he did this every day or constantly or whatever. And to cut a long story short, the stone throwing actually had a very clear function or purpose, which was to communicate with staff. And what he was communicating was that he was wound up. So what he was saying was, I would really like to sit down and have a talk or a conversation about what's winding me up. And it worked very well because typically what would happen when Richard threw a stone and broke a window is the staff would rush out and talk to him and say, why did you do that? What's the matter? And so on. And they would in fact have a conversation. In point of fact, Richard wasn't very articulate, so really needed the member of staff to be one that he got on with, the one who could communicate as best as possible with him. And that, of course, tended to be the person who went to him when he broke the windows. So once they had realized this, what the staff did was to give Richard a card that said, conversation, please, written on the card. And he was able to show the card actually to any staff member. And the staff all knew that what was required of them was to go and get somebody who was good at talking to Richard, to sit down, have a conversation with him about whatever was bothering him. Now, you might be wondering just how the staff realized that this was what Richard was saying, and he wasn't just being kind of vandalous. And what the reason why Richard broke windows was to ask for a conversation to reduce his agitation. Now, two things normally. Sometimes people just have a hunch. People who know the patient's concerns simply have a hunch or an insight as to why they do it. And that hunch can be very, very good. It can be wrong, of course, but that doesn't normally cause terrific problems. It's simply wrong, and you can have another hunch which might be right. The other technique that people use is what we call an ABC analysis. ABC in this instance standing for antecedents, behavior, consequences. So in the case of Richard, we can see that the antecedents were feelings of being unsettled. The behavior was throwing stones at windows and breaking them. And the consequence was that a nice member of staff, namely one that he got on with, would come and have a conversation and make him feel less unsettled. So put like that, it's easy to see why Richard persisted in what he did, and that worked well for him. And in a task like that, our job is to find something that works just as well for him. In this case, giving him a card that he'd simply show to a member of staff to get himself a conversation. He actually liked that member of card. It made him feel sort of good handing over the card. I'm getting ahead of ourselves slightly now, but this illustrates a very important principle, namely that when you realize what the function of the behavior is, your task is to find a more helpful way for that patient to achieve the exact same function, at least as well. Well, so far as it goes, I guess that probably sounds perfectly reasonable. But what about attention-seeking behavior? Often enough, people will be falsely accused of attention-seeking, but equally, often enough, they really are seeking attention. And why not? Most people want attention from time to time. But it is interesting to see the typical response of even some very good professionals when they have diagnosed a particular behavior as attention-seeking. They may say, this is attention-seeking behavior. We must make sure we don't give them attention when they do this. It'll encourage them. To me, this draws a parallel with your car running out of fuel and you standing by it at the side of the road shouting at it and berating it that this is just fuel-seeking behavior. Cars need fuel, or electricity maybe, which I suppose is fuel, just as people need attention. And the parallel goes a bit further very often. Just as with your car, the only solution is to give it some more fuel, and furthermore, that if you had given it some fuel earlier on, then it would never have run out of fuel in the first place. The same thing sometimes applies to patients, namely that in crisis, the only solution is to give the person the attention they crave. But furthermore, if we had given them more attention earlier on, maybe the crisis might not have happened. In fact, attention-seeking behavior is particularly interesting, I think. A lot of children and adolescents will deliberately misbehave in order to get attention in the form of the parent being angry with them in some way. On the face of it, this hardly makes sense because the attention they get is like bad attention. And they know that right from when they start to misbehave. The normal answer, the normal accepted wisdom to this conundrum is that any attention is better than no attention at all.
Samantha's helpfully put that she's learned a lot about this from RAID, and there are a couple of questions asking what RAID is.
Oh, righto. Well, RAID is a course specifically for people who work with very challenging behavior. And it's a very positive response to challenging behavior. And it stands for reinforce appropriate, implode difficult or disruptive behavior. I know that because I actually wrote it a while ago. And since then, I think it's over 25,000 people have attended it, 25,000 professionals who work with disturbed people. And I think it's terrific. I'm delighted about that because it is relentlessly positive, and it's all about encouraging people to do positive behavior, and just so that it displaces the negative behavior.
Sounds like you're a good person to ask about that one. Okay, we'll just carry on.
And that's probably not a bad answer, but on the other hand, there might be a better one. And this goes back to our functional analysis. In the example of our misbehaving child or adolescent, we are saying that the function of the misbehavior is to get any attention. Well, what if we're not right? And a better account of precisely what the function is, that it is to obtain stimulation or interest. And I believe this is often the case. In such cases, it would work well, just as well or better, to prompt the child to do something that would be stimulating or interesting for them. Depending on the child, that might be a computer game, watching TV, reading a book, going out, finding a friend to play sport with, practicing their makeup skills, or whatever. None of these are actually attention, but they all provide the child with stimulation and interest. And if that's what they're after, then these would work just as well or even better. Now, what if you're saying to yourself, well, that's all very well and interesting, but I don't work with self-harming adolescents, misbehaving children, or even 57-year-old adults who throw stones at their windows. I work mainly with people who are depressed and anxious, so how does this apply to my patients? To answer this, let's consider depression for a moment, and let's be clear on the nature of depression. It's called depression because a whole host of factors are depressed or lowered or pushed down. So not only is a person's mood depressed or lowered, their general activity level is often very severely depressed or lowered to the extent that they may sit apathetically, catatonically almost, doing nothing for hours. Now, on the face of it, this is pretty strange, especially when you see people who were previously very active, busy, successful, full of energy and vitality. And by the way, vitality is probably the most accurate opposite of depression, better than happiness, I think. Anyway, how could it possibly be that such an energetic, busy and successful person could be overtaken by depression, where they sit and do little or nothing for hours on end? Bear in mind that such a person does not do this deliberately. It's not as though they said to themselves, I think I'm fed up with being incredibly busy, active and successful. I think I'm going to just sit around and look out of the windows day after day. That's not how it is. The depression is involuntary and actually overtakes the person against their will. Well, I don't know what your answer is, but I've seen plenty of people just like the person I've kind of summarized and characterized there. And I'm convinced that this is the deep brain's self-regulatory mechanism, intervening for the benefit of the person's long-term well-being. As though it says, look, if you can't regulate yourself to lead a less busy and hectic life, just a life that is ordinarily busy, a sustainable life, then I'm going to have to regulate you instead. And that's what it does. Very like when somebody faints. When the fainting achieves for the person is to lower the head on account of them falling to the floor, and this increases the amount of oxygen getting to the brain simply because the heart can pump more blood to the brain, because it doesn't have to pump against gravity, it doesn't have to pump uphill. If the person were to wisely sit down or lie down as soon as they begin to feel faint, then they don't actually faint.
Just got a good tricky question for you here, Will.
Right.
Asked, is there any evidence of functional analysis in psychosis?
Well, that is a good question. You're quite right, and it's something that people debate endlessly. What causes psychosis? I mean, my answer would be yes, simply on the grounds that functional analysis applies right across the board. So the question we'd have to ask ourselves then is, does having psychosis, having psychotic episodes, does that exclude you from all the normal processes that govern our behavior? And of course it doesn't, I would say. It's just exactly the same kind of things work for people who have psychotic episodes as work for the rest of us. But they do have a different overlay as well.
Super. I hope that helps, Sandeep. I'll keep.
Because the same effect has been achieved voluntarily or consciously. And there are parallels, I think, with depression, as you've seen, and also anxiety, just the same. Other depressed people may be depressed because they're leading depressing lives. They may have an unrewarding partner, an unrewarding job, and unrewarding friends. No rewarding hobbies. In that case, we could say that the function served by the depression is to stop them interacting with their depressing environment, to protect them from it, which makes good sense, and we can see the solution, to help them make their surroundings more rewarding or to appreciate their surroundings.
Is it important to discuss the functional analysis with your client?
Yes, I think so. I think it's a cornerstone of good therapy normally, to be having a cooperative, joint enterprise, working together. Absolutely so, yes. Occasionally it's not, but those are the exceptions. 99 times out of 100, yes.
And Samir is curious about your thoughts on if someone engages in a behaviour that they identify as being unhelpful, but they still continue to engage in it.
Yeah. Sometimes people will choose the least worst option. Like, I think self-harm is an excellent example of that. It works incredibly well for a lot of people. It reduces their distress, just like popping a balloon, works incredibly well. So do they like doing it? No, they don't. They'd much prefer to have a better alternative to that. So yeah, it's the least worst action sometimes. More suitable surroundings to themselves, or more appreciated. You can also see the function in some anxieties. When we see someone who's anxious, we normally offer them support and help in some way. If a friend is anxious, we tend to be supportive, especially if they're a loved one. And that support may be crucial to the person concerned. They may very much need it. So in that case, it's a very simple function in some cases of anxiety. Not that anxiety itself is simple, it's very, very disabling for a lot of people. But you can see that it could be, in some cases, quite a simple function like that. But I'm not saying that all depression and all anxiety serves a function for the person. Often enough, it really doesn't, as far as I can see. And we need to look at it a different way. And like we said at the beginning, we also need to rule out physical causes such as hypo or hyperthyroidism, and consider biological interventions such as diet and exercise, and cognitive interventions, and genetic factors, all of which can underlie it. Equally though, if the problem does serve an important function for the person and we don't realize that, then the problem is going to be very, very difficult ever to resolve. Equally though, if we do realize what the function is, we can very quickly resolve it sometimes. So anyway, we are doing our functional analysis, analyzing all the assessment information we've gathered, seeing whether the problem is serving any function for the person. And there are two principles that we must bear in mind. The first is that the person isn't normally aware of the function it achieves for them. So even the person who self-harms may not be consciously aware that they do it to reduce the level of tension. It may be obvious once we've discussed and analyzed it with them, and sometimes it's obvious to them right from the start, but other times it isn't. Richard, who would throw stones at windows to gain a conversation with his preferred member of staff, may or may not have been able to reason out that that is a good means of achieving that. And certainly the depressed person and the person who can't walk, in neither of those examples were the patients doing it deliberately. So the first principle is that often enough, the person doesn't know themselves what the function is. And the second principle is that when we have uncovered the function or the purpose, our task is to help the patient achieve that same functional purpose in a way that works better for them. A couple of other things though. The first is that there are some people who do unusual things and are very well aware of their purpose or function. For instance, some people who have been diagnosed with personality disorder, a few such people will say things like, "Unless you see me right now, I'm going to kill myself." And obviously this is a blatant threat or intimidation, whatever word you want to apply. Most people simply wouldn't do that or say that, but some people will. And indeed, there are some who will carry out such a threat. There are people who have literally taken their own lives to teach somebody a lesson. It doesn't make sense, does it? The person is no longer around to see the other person learn their lesson. But nevertheless, it still occurs. There are good ways of handling such things, but we can't look at them just now. We can later on, the later module. Let me tell you about a patient who illustrates this approach and how it can work very simply, even with very serious patients. A patient who sticks in my mind forever, even though I saw him before I was clinically trained. I'd done my degree in psychology, but not my postgrad clinical qualification, was a man in prison, a prisoner, and he spent all his time fantasizing and planning about shooting 6 particular prison officers for reasons we needn't go into, but that's how he spent all his time, as he put it, fantasizing and planning about murdering these 6 guys. Another factor was that he was in prison for shooting somebody, so I took it extra seriously. It wasn't just bravado, maybe. And another factor was that he found it very difficult doing his time. He found being in prison very difficult. So what do you think the function of him planning and fantasizing about shooting 6 prison officers could be? Clearly, or it seemed to me clearly at any rate, the best function of it was to take him away from his surroundings. He had, in a sense, retreated into his head, and he was immersed in how great this was going to be, and how he was going to do it, and how he was going to get caught, and how he'd be famous for having done this, and how he'd be housed in a special prison, and how everyone would look up to him and revere him and so on. Actually, I'm not quite sure that he actually said revere, but you get the gist. So this was a big contrast in his head to the rather nasty surroundings we found ourselves in day to day in the prison we were in. And yes, the point of the story was that when we gave him something else to think about and immerse himself in, namely an alternative viable plan, and in those days there weren't very many viable plans, but this was an alternative viable plan for him to go to a hostel down in Somerset, a hostel which took in people like himself upon his release, and he immersed himself in that. And he'd write to the hostel and plan and see what could be done and what he might be able to do and so on. And he equally immersed himself in those thoughts and that planning. So one of his assets, one of his positives, was that he was able to immerse himself in things, good things as well as bad things. And so that's what we did. That's what happened. And that's what happened upon his release. He did indeed go to that actual hostel that he had been communicating with. Let me give you another example of functional analysis. Another man, in this case, he had damaged his head quite severely, and he had quite a significant brain injury. So at the point he came to us, he'd been in a locked facility for 7 years because he had the habit of grabbing hold of women, basically sexually assaulting women. Now, if you look at the function of that, there's a problem, because the problem with sexual assaults like this is the function is intrinsic to the behavior. Clearly, the function of the behavior is sexual pleasure. And that's part and parcel of the actual offending, or the actual complaint we're looking at, if you like. But still, what we do is we find him a better way of helping him to achieve the same function. So in that case, it meant supporting him and allowing him to think through how he might find a girlfriend. So that's exactly what we did. But there's still another problem, and that it is intrinsically reinforcing nature of the offending, the sexual assaults. So in a case like that, it's often necessary to balance the intrinsic reward with a counterbalancing consequence. In this case, what we did, with his permission and with his agreement and with his planning with us, was that every time he grabbed hold of somebody, sexually assaulted them, we put him in a time-out room, as it was called, a time-out room for 10 minutes. So not a terribly aversive consequence. There's nothing nasty about the room concerned. And he was there for just 10 minutes. And the way we described it to him, and I think the way it really was that we were retraining the brain. So that's what we did. And we plotted out on a graph how his number of sexual assaults gradually declined. It zigzagged a bit, obviously, but it steadily came down, and it came down to 0. With the result that he was able to go on unescorted leave around the grounds of the hospital, and eventually unescorted leave into town. So this was fantastic progress for him. It transformed his life. He had been locked on a ward for 7 years. Of course, unknown to him, we trailed him for the protection of other people in the hospital and other people in the town. We had somebody trail him, and different people trail him to see that everyone was okay. And I'm not sure, this was a long time ago, and I'm not sure whether such a procedure would now be allowed. Whether it's okay to do this even in specialized units like this one was. So I'm not sure whether that would be acceptable now. I think it would probably be a pity if it wasn't, because it was never aversive for him, and the result of it was transformational to his life. And I remember his brother being so pleased with what had been achieved for him. Anyway, you can see that's twofold, in that we helped him find a better way of achieving the function of the behavior, helped him look for a girlfriend, and we also counterbalanced the innate function of the behavior he was doing.
Okay, well, we've got a few questions. Sorry, they've just shot up my screen. How would you use this for a person who is struggling to manage sobriety?
Alcohol dependency is always a problem, because you've got two problems going on. On the one hand, you've got the exactly what we're talking about, the functional analysis. The person will have developed their alcohol problem for a purpose. either because of anxiety or simply because there's a mixture of reducing anxiety and pleasure in just drinking, whatever it is. It will have developed for some function which we could address. Trouble is, though, addressing that function, sorting that one out, isn't sufficient, because you now have the physiological effect of alcohol. It is an addictive substance, so the person is actually addicted to it. So you have to help them to address that addiction as one thing, but also to address the original function of the behavior. So just to withdraw their alcohol so they get put back in an anxiety-provoking, unrewarding situation, that's not enough. You have to do a two-pronged attack, if you like.
And have you tried this for peer-to-peer mentoring? So service users who have an understanding of their behaviour can now support other service users with this process instead of just professionals.
Yes. Well, if you work in groups, of course, and a lot of substance misuse, for example, is addressed in groups. And well, all sorts of problems are addressed in groups. Anxiety problems, likewise, and so on, work very well in groups. Yeah, it works splendidly there. Yeah.
Super. So just the last bit, and then I'll try and get through as many questions as possible.
Okay. So there we are. That's functional analysis. So let's just see if we can summarize it. Always look for a function in your patient's problem. Use an ABC analysis if you want antecedents, behavior, consequences. Or you can just have a hunch and check that hunch out by experimenting as though it is correct. But don't be too convinced that there must be a function to the problem, because sometimes there isn't. But often there is, and in those times, if you don't realize there's a function to the problem and what it is, then it will be difficult to resolve the problem. Always be really sure there isn't a physical cause to any problems. When there is a function to the problem, then the usual answer is to help the person to achieve the function in a better way. For example, the function of the self-harm is often to reduce distress. So our task in that case is to help the person find a better way of reducing distress, so they don't need to harm themselves. Other times, the function can be intrinsic to the behavior, part and parcel of the behavior, like sex offending, for instance. The function of the behavior is to get sexual pleasure very often. In this case, it's more involved because, yes, you still help the person to achieve the function in a better way, but you may have to counterbalance the reward that's intrinsic to the behavior with a counterbalancing consequence. So, good luck with all of that. It should be interesting and rewarding, both for you and for your patients.
Okay, well, are you ready? You've got some good questions. Okay, can aspects of this approach be used to help understand challenging behaviour in people with dementia?
Absolutely so. Absolutely, yes. I think those of us who haven't got dementia find it more difficult to understand what the function might be. And I think you end up doing like an ABC analysis very often and really kind of analysing what's going on. But absolutely, yes, yes.
Fabulous. And it's hard work to work with someone with personality disorder who says that they will kill themselves right now if you don't see them, call them. What have you found helpful?
De-personalizing the issue. You have to depersonalize it. For example, you can say something like, "I'm not allowed to respond to threats, but I would like to help you as much as I can with what we are able to do." So you start off with the depersonalization. I'm not allowed to respond to threats, and then you go back into therapeutic mode and genuinely try and help the person as much as you can, in spite of the fact they've just been threatening you.
What if the client doesn't want to change the destructive behaviour and doesn't believe something else would be as helpful, for example, mindfulness instead of marijuana?
Well, that's a question of guided discovery, isn't it? Asking questions, asking the pros and cons of marijuana, asking the pros and cons of mindfulness or something else. And I think we have to go into that with an open mind. Because sometimes when you talk to people who do some very strange things, and when you talk to them about the pros and cons of staying as they are, and also the pros and cons of changing, you are quite shaken by the end of it. You think, well, they do have a point, you know. Uh, Even the prisoner I spoke to, he was intent on shooting 6 prison officers. He was very convincing, and a logical argument. He easily out-argued me that he's going to be famous. As he put it, he's going to be more famous than I would ever be. He was going to be like notorious in the prison. He'd be moved to a better prison for life sentence prisoners rather than the local prison we were in. And he had a whole string of things that were advantages of carrying through what he was planning. And it is quite salutary sometimes when you listen to the pros and cons of different options that people have in front of them. So we do have to ask the question genuinely and listen to what they say.
How could you incorporate this into an integrative or person-centered approach?
Well, I think it is a very person-centered approach. It is really honing down on the person and seeing what the function is for them. Not what the behavior might generally have a function of, but for them what the function is.
And do you ever use STAR analysis as well as ABC analysis to unpick the function of the behavior? STAR, which is setting, trigger, actions, and results.
Yes, yeah, that is almost, with all due respect to both ABC and STAR, they both pretty much cover the same ground, really.
And finally, I think we've got one last question. How would you guard against misinterpretation or multiple functions in analysis? For example, seal gratification versus seeking power versus meeting sensory needs.
Yeah. That's simply a very complex example. That sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? Simply a very complex example. But the same principles apply. That's what I'm trying to say. That if one behavior or one set of behaviors gives the person several payoffs, even below the level of conscious awareness, then we've got to satisfy those several payoffs, even though they're not necessarily doing it deliberately, usually not doing it deliberately. We still have to suss out what those several payoffs are and satisfy all of them.
And I'll sneak in one more. Kata, I'm sorry about if I'm mispronouncing your name, works as a pediatric psychologist. Many times children have somatization symptoms. Functional analysis is very clear to her, but many times parents persistently search for organic causes, although they have been informed about emotional causes. What questions could you ask in that case?
I think you ask exactly the same questions, but I think that is a real problem that's highlighted there, because sometimes different complaints are described as functional, and the person saying that is almost it comes over as a little bit kind of rude or insulting. It's not a real complaint, it's just functional. There's no physical cause, it's just functional. And sometimes they'll say just in front of the word functional. And it's strange, really, because functional complaints are just as much complaints as any other complaints. And sometimes you suspect that there may be a physical cause, it simply hasn't been found yet, and it's being labeled as functional. A bit like digestive ulcers. Ulcers are always put down to stress, and they're not at all. They are actually caused by infections, and antibiotics cure them. But until that was found out, they were put down as stress.
That's been wonderful. There seems to be a lot of information that's gone on to this afternoon. But we have got a final slide, which is because we're often asked where people want to go to find out about higher order therapy. And if you do want to find out more about higher order therapy, you need to go to www.aptonlinetraining.com. And these sessions are all recorded. So if you've missed any or want to go back and have another look, go back and direct your colleagues to www.apt.ac and then search for the free webinars. So just again, just 1 second. So we, as we've all said, the event is completely free of charge as part of our response to COVID-19. So we're so pleased to see so many of you again attending it. And obviously feel free to invite others to future events. As Will said, next week's going to all be about what is DBT. We're not sure how many free sessions we'll be hosting. It depends on a couple of things, how long COVID lasts and how much interest there is. But we're thrilled to see hundreds and hundreds of you here again. We love it. And I love seeing the familiar names again and from all over the world as well. And as always, a certificate will be emailed to you by the end of the week. So check your junk box if you haven't got it by Friday, but it will be popping up again there. Have you got anything else to add, Will?
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, a lot of people are interested in DBT, so I thought we'd try and do a kind of 1 hour summary of DBT, see what we can do in that time. So yeah, thanks, James, and everybody.
Fabulous. See you all next week, I hope.
See you then.
Bye.